Today I'm with Frances Williams, who's my wife and a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. In 2019 we presented a paper at the International Psychoanalytical Association's Congress in London. It was chaired by the renowned British psychoanalyst Irma Brenman-Pick. It was a real honour. This series comprises diptychs, the first image taken during the turbulent transition to democracy in the early 1990s in South Africa, coupled with a follow-up photograph taken more recently at the same place. The presentation was a psychoanalytical response to various of my photographic bodies of work covering change within South Africa. In this first video in the series, Frances reads her essay Over Time.
As Graham says, I'm going to read one of the essays titled Over Time in our collaborative project. Photographically, this project is a record of South African history over the past 30 years, as reflected through Graham's eyes. Textually, it is my psychoanalytical and invariably also personal response to this record. A reflection of some of the nation's dynamics, in particular defence mechanisms and the process of change. I draw some parallels between the art of psychoanalysis and photography and how countertransference is present wherever and whenever you look. In a broad brush stroke, transference is a psychoanalytic idea which proposes that we play out our past relational experiences, particularly early ones, in our present-day life. We do this partly by projecting them onto people and situations. Countertransference is a response that is evoked in the person being projected onto and into. Both these dynamics are often unconscious, but shape our lived experience. The working title of this project was previously Significant Places. Travelling back to a place where something of significance to us took place is not uncommon. It can be a way of connecting with an earlier self, lost objects, our own or more ancient history, and a way of remembering. It can also be an attempt to move on, to lay something to rest. Sometimes we are unable to go back to the scene of the event, be it a place of celebration or a trauma. We might prefer to freeze frame the memory, or we might not have been able to recover or to mourn. We might then only travel to the scene in our dreams or relive it in our bodies, repeating rather than remembering.
The photograph on the left was taken in 1989 and documents the first day where black people were legally allowed to swim with white people on the beaches, while the photograph on the right, taken in 2012, shows the outline of young girls from a nearby township looking down upon a sand sculpture molded into the form of a woman sunbathing.
It could be said that the journey of a psychoanalytical treatment has partly as its map previously significant places, helping patients to chart territories which at the time they had no compass for. Initially, Graham's returns to past places were a creative inquiry into change in South Africa and whether these locations, many of them sites of great moments of change, had themselves changed or held traces of the past event. The first part of the diptychs are images of an extraordinary time in South African history, but one can see how manic defences were necessary in order to manage the overwhelm and the aftermath. In the second part, for Graham, the glow of the promise of the Rainbow Nation had clouded somewhat post Nelson Mandela's presidency. At first, some of the diptychs emerged as a commentary, really, on the ephemeral nature of life. Things come and then they go, and one can live alongside another's experience, never knowing it existed. However, other of the diptychs, when looked at together, reflect both overt and more subtle shadows of repetition. In our consulting rooms, we see the repetition compulsion play out in a myriad ways. It is not only a defence against remembering, but also against change. Change might be the thing our patients want most when they knock at our door, but for many reasons it's also the thing that they most fear. When looking at this essay, there is a particular focus on change as well as an expectation of it, and disappointment when the hope is not realised. It is as if the photographer has lost hope in some ways, or certainly has lost the illusion, the idea of a quick fix. We too, as clinicians and our patients, discover this as time goes along. After the first flash of insight, there can be many long years before structural change really takes place. Insight doesn't necessarily equate to change. The process of change can be excruciatingly slow, with casualties along the way.
The image on the left, taken in 1990, shows right-wing protesters gathering in the centre of Pretoria to voice their anger at the steps that the then President F.W. de Klerk was taking in order to dismantle apartheid. The photograph on the right, taken in 2013, shows Felicia Simoshili posing for a local portrait photographer at the foot of a bronze statue of an Afrikaner soldier. Church Square is dominated by a plinth containing a statue of an Afrikaner leader, Paul Kruger, surrounded by 4 anonymous Boer citizen soldiers. The square is a popular meeting place for young black Pretoria residents. There are generally between 10 and 20 portrait photographers offering their services, and the Boer statues are used as their backdrops.
Professor of Photography Dave Bate presented a paper in 2014 titled The Memory of Photography, where he makes a link between photography and Freud's idea of screen memories. Not false, but the challenge of analytic inquiry is to extract from the screen memory the essential thing with which the memory trace is occupied and that has been obscured by repression and distortion. Freud suggests that screen memories offer, I quote, a remarkable analogy with the childhood memories that a nation preserves in its store of legends and myths. Furthermore, fairy tales, Freud says, can be made use of as screen memories in the same kind of way that empty shells are used as a home by the hermit crab. Bate proposes in his paper that perhaps similarly a significant photograph might also be an empty shell for a story about a nation. The image is used as a space, a location for memory traces. He makes a link with the distinction between voluntary and involuntary memory as posited by writer Marcel Proust in his work In Search of Lost Time, suggesting that historical photographs can be treated with precisely this type of critical model for interpretation. As with human memory, says Bate, we can no longer verify the original experience or sensation of the photograph, but the image provides a scene in which we may bring voluntary or involuntary memories to bear upon it. Voluntary memory is like the work of history. Involuntary memory belongs to personal affect. Both photographs were taken at a home in a quiet suburb in the mining town Welkom. The first image on the left, taken in 1990, shows the right-wing AWB leader Eugene Terblanche and his supporters in a show of force. They marched through the streets of this small town in order to display their anger at the government's decision to transform the country. On the right, the photograph taken in 2012 shows a water feature that's been placed in the gardens during the time since that event. The second images in the diptychs provide fertile ground for his projections. However, similarly to the perils of analyst-driven countertransference when with a patient, documentary photographers are warned against the projection of their own selves or part selves onto or into their subjects. When photographer Robert Adams speaks of transparency, he means that the photographer should value what is in front of him as much as possible. It's what folks who believe in straight photography do. The world outside oneself is bigger than one's idea of it. One tries to align oneself with that bigger world in making a picture, he says. The truth of the matter, when one person is looking at another, is always easier said than done, both for psychotherapists and photographers. Overtime is interesting in this way, as the first part of the diptych is consciously intended to make a picture for the world, an example of straight photography perhaps. Whilst taking the second image in the diptych, Graham is intentionally more subjectively involved. The world in him not necessarily bigger than the world outside, but certainly there is a stronger and more stated psychodynamic at play, this being analogous to contemporary concepts of countertransference. The photograph on the left, taken in 1994, shows a supporter of the Inkatha Freedom Party who was shot dead during a march in Johannesburg. Minutes earlier, he had been walking between myself and a traffic policeman as we tried to catch up with the main body of a marching group. While we were chatting, an African National Congress sniper shot him from a nearby building. On the right, a photograph taken in 2014 of a young foreigner who tries to make a living as a street photographer, but battles xenophobic violence and police intimidation and corruption. During the early 1990s, the time of the first images, South Africa was in flames. The period of conflict preceding the first democratic elections in 1994 was littered with dead bodies. Early every morning as the light came up, Graham and his colleagues would leave their leafy white suburbs and go and shoot the carnage of the night before. There were clashes between police, township residents, tribal groups, political groups, white, black, Afrikaans, English. On one occasion, Graham did his personal morning body count. It totaled 12. Documenting South Africa in transition was extraordinary, filled with adrenaline and very dangerous. Colleagues were killed in crossfire or by their own hand. You could feel invincible. In fact, you had to feel invincible. Graham went on and on shooting. Enrique Bastos writes of countertransference voyeurism. This refers to a type of defensive numbing in the listener or watcher, which enables him to go on and on without succumbing to emotional exhaustion. However, this can also stimulate a type of unconscious addiction to working with victims of trauma, of not being able to get enough of it. Over this period, Graham would return from his morning photographing dead bodies to spend his afternoon on an unpaid private project, what he referred to as a personal project, documenting the care of terminally ill patients at an HIV/AIDS hospice. Partly a restorative space where people died with dignity, both subjecting himself repetitively to observing people dying. The repetition compulsion, reparation, and an unconscious wish to be looked after by himself by the Catholic nun working at the hospice is a question. It was only in March 1994 when some Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging members, a right-wing militant group, stuck a shotgun in Graham's mouth, that a few days afterwards, driving back from yet another assignment, he hit a psychic wall. Booking himself into a roadside motel, he slept for 24 hours. From then on, it wasn't so easy to cut off. Omnipotence and invincibility were no longer accessible, which made him more and less safe. His feelings were at first somatic and went into his back. Later they came back into his mind. He did less and less news and began to work on his personal essays, over time as one of these projects.
The image on the left, taken in 1994, is of Lenny Moeng being taken off to the hospital after being shot by a right-wing supporter. 3 young right-wingers saw me photographing a middle-aged man as he shot Lenny with a hunting rifle. They beat me up, took my cameras and film, and at one point during the assault a shotgun was forced into my mouth. An older man luckily walked past and said in Afrikaans, "Don't shoot him, beat him up." The photograph on the right, taken in 2012, shows Rose Subelekwa standing in her house, which was formerly occupied by the victim of the shooting, Lenny, who was a friend and neighbour.
If one takes a look at the later images in the diptychs, it's easier to see what Graham is feeling, both for some of his subjects and about some of them. British psychoanalyst Hannah Siegel suggests in a paper on artistic creativity, and also drawing on Proust, that Proust, captures poignantly in many of his writings what is present in the unconscious of all artists. Based on years of self-observation and reflection, Proust describes how creation is really a recreation of a once loved and once whole but now lost and ruined object, a ruined internal world and self. Out of this place of fragments we must recreate our world, reassemble the pieces and infuse life into lost or dead fragments. This is reflected painfully in this image.
The photograph on the left, taken in 1992 in Alexandra Township, Johannesburg. The body was covered in a newspaper after being found in the road following a night of violence between supporters of the African National Congress and members of the Inkatha Freedom Party. The image on the right, taken in 2013, Bakazili Zimba, now 64 years old, still lives in the shack alongside the site where the earlier killing occurred. She remembers seeing that body, but says that since that time, crime has become the major problem in the area. Last year, a body was dumped outside a shack. She said the criminals removed the victim's teeth and eyes in order to avoid identification.
Alongside many artists, whilst Graham might be driven by his inside history, developmental as well as fault lines, external life, particularly in such a strange place as South Africa, cannot not have shaped his work. It would be denial to believe that to have spent one's 60 years as a white or black person, male or female, rich or poor, in South Africa wouldn't have had a major impact on the splits and the fault lines. Graham has travelled all over South Africa, mainly in very deprived areas, and those most impacted by inequality. He has spent many years photographing Johannesburg's very dangerous inner city. I'm often scared. I've tried not to think about him out on the streets in the middle of the night, in places that I can't imagine. I often employ magical thinking. I touch wood, I cross my fingers before he leaves. But I have watched Graham. He is watchful, but he seldom appears scared. I've wondered if that because, unlike me, he didn't grow up behind white walls or in private schools, he is streetwise and there's less of a distinction for him between in here and out there. Or is the opportunity to make pictures out of pain so compelling that this drives him to override his conditioned fear? His backstory is one of deprivation and creativity. Is he more at home out there, or is he reminding himself over and over that he escaped his own wastelands? Is he triumphant, or is he sorry? The same kind of observation could be made, as British psychoanalyst Roger Monicol suggests, of psychoanalysts and their work as being partly motivated by a quest to engage with their damaged internal objects in one way or another.
The image on the left, taken in 1991, policemen clash with farmers as they protest against the impact that political transformation will have on the white farming community. The photograph on the right, taken in 2012, Pretoria University student Zane Shimba leans on a tree directly opposite where the earlier picture was taken. He is studying social work in the hope of helping other people in his community.
In an essay on Graham's work, shot in the inner city of Johannesburg, a city refracted, writer Leon de Kock, who emigrated to America, comments, "The paradoxes and contradictions of Joburg are almost violent and certainly visceral, as is a confrontation of the luxury SUV, a four-wheel drive, just emerged out of Westcliff Ridge's Palace of Plenty, with beggars on their knees at intersections just a few blocks away. To witness this egregious excess of such wealth on the one hand and the hellish desperation of the street outcasts on the other is like a knife between the ribs." Deciding on how to live decently with this recognition is one of the main moral tasks facing all people in our country, and in fact many countries around the world. As photographer David Goldblatt, who died 4 years ago and was Graham's most significant male figure, says, "During those years, the apartheid years, my primary concern was with values. What did we value in South Africa? How did we get those values, and how did we express those values? This is a question as true of the there and then as it is of the here and now for all South Africans."
I too coming from South Africa, and Francis is a psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapist so we're going to see some of Graham's pictures, and then Francis is going to talk to us about how we look at things, what we look at, and what we choose not to look at.